Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human.
Hello, Mitch.
Blake Gopnik, welcome to our show, A Journey of an Aesthete podcast.
Pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You know, I should say a few introductory remarks, if you don't mind. I feel we've had so many different kinds of people on our show, critics and painters and sculptors and musicians. And you're on mainly, you're a great art critic, but also you've written what appears to be the definitive book on Warhol.
That was the goal. I won't declare it. That's too much of a claim for me to make. But I was trying to be comprehensive, if nothing else.
It's very comprehensive, and I read the whole thing. And I even did a video piece on it a couple of weeks ago, and I love the book. And there's so much to talk about, not only just Warhol, but also, of course, your background as an art critic, how you came to do that kind of writing and that kind of work, coming out of Philadelphia, it seems, in Pennsylvania. Of course, your illustrious family and siblings, if you want to discuss that, and anything else that comes into your mind. But I was I want to start off out of order because you've written a piece on one of my favorite books, and that's Susan Maisel's Carnival Strippers. This came up in my feed, yes?
Yeah, that's right. That is a fabulous thing.
And you wrote that when you wrote that just today, right? Yes, it's one of your posts, right?
It was for the New York Times, actually. I wrote a little piece for the New York Times, and I reposted it on my own website.
Oh, that's
but yeah, just a little piece about the color photographs that were discovered from that series. I mean, the black and whites are one of the most famous series of photographs in photo book history.
Absolutely.
But she was digging in her storage and found out, as she'd completely forgotten, that she'd also shot color slides at the same time.
Wow.
As she was shooting the famous black and white. So there's only a few of them. I don't know, a couple of dozen maybe, probably one roll or a few rolls.
Yeah.
But they really do give a whole new sense of that shoot. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, they are beautiful. Well, that's news to me, and I'm sure it's news to you, and you wrote about it. That's one of my favorite books by her. I think she's probably more well known for her Nicaraguan and more of her work, right, South America. But that Carnival Strippers is an incredible book.
Absolutely.
For those that don't know Susan Maisel, what would you say about that book or that the significance of it in terms of history of rural life in America or that kind of entertainment or photography or?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about rural life in America. I'm a real city slicker, but I think it's really important for the history of photography because there's a sense of contact between Susan and her subjects in that book that had rarely really been allowed before in photojournalism, for want of a better word. There's a real sense of intimacy, of collaboration in there, and an acknowledgement of that. I mean, obviously, every time someone takes a photograph of someone else, there's some kind of collaboration going on, unless they're taking it secretly.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, there was really a sense of contact between the two, between the photographer and the women who are stripping in these very rural carnivals. And in my recent piece for the Times, I argued that that was because they were actually closer together sociologically than one would imagine. That is, being a very young woman trying to break into photography or photojournalism left you stranded professionally in some of the same ways that being a stripper did. So I think that may be one of the points of contact. I think we've forgotten just how viciously male chauvinist the whole world was in America was in the 1970s. That for Susan to do what she did required, in a sense, the same guts as it took for the strippers to strip.
To strip, oh, absolutely. Well, I've been a fan of that book. So, I have a first edition of that, and it's one of the few books that I saved and carried when I moved. And I've always wanted her to be a guest on the show, so that's in the back of my mind to have her potentially be a guest. Not to get too far away from the subject of you, but you know her other work, of course, in Central America, right? And she was very involved, I think in Nicaragua, right?
No, that's right. I mean, she's really famous. Funnily enough, she's more famous for that work, which has some of the same qualities as that first book of stripper photographs. There's also an unusual intimacy for what strike one as photojournalistic works. Yeah, definitely one of the great photographers. And if I can direct our conversation back to my favorite topic, which is Warhol, you could argue that there are kind of roots in Warhol to what she did.
Oh, absolutely.
Roots is probably the wrong word in a way, because
agree. I totally see it. I mean, I see the factory in that. I see. I mean, again, we have a lot to talk about. I mean, Warhol is deeply underrated and misunderstood as an artist. I mean, I've discussed this in me and Jay Weig talk about this a lot. Jay Weig, but I feel one of the way I discovered Warhol was through his film work. The 60s. Excellent. Before really I knew about that stuff more intimately than the paintings or the illustrations. And it's interesting because I got to screen them properly because my friend Saul Levine has all the original prints of Couch and Kiss and Chelsea Girls, and he would show Chelsea Girls and project it in the proper manner, with the two projectors and all the instructions and everything. And those films, seeing those really blew my mind. I mean, to me, this was really great cinema. And it was as good as any avant-garde cinema I'd seen. And in some cases, I'm sure you'll agree, way ahead of its time, I think, in what he's doing with the figures in the film and time and duration. And is that, what would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're definitely some of his very, very greatest works. I mean, among film connoisseurs especially, but even among art connoisseurs, they're extremely well known. But the general public, it's true, is fixated on Campbell soups and Brillo boxes, and really doesn't understand. I mean, until quite recently, it was awfully hard to get to see the films. I mean, now the Warhol Museum, quite recently, has been streaming them for a relatively reasonable fee. They stream a couple at a time, and they'll be changing them, I think, every few months, the ones that are available. But there's 1 million feet of film that they're working through to figure out exactly what the Warhol filmography is like. But, some of those movies, his great film stills, these are 4-minute portraits of people, with an unmoving camera, are, I think, some of the greatest portraits of all time, easily up there with Rembrandt or any other great portraits you could name.
Yeah, I'm so really you make that comparison. I'm so glad that you're on our show to express that again, because there still is, unfortunately, some kind of lazy anti-Warhol sentiment around and people that don't understand.
I mean, I'm one of the people who've actually sat through all of Empire, beginning to end, watching it on film, proper film, once. Yes. And I've seen large chunks of it more than once. And I actually think it's absolutely worth the effort. Oh, yeah. If you take it seriously, you really have to make the effort. You can't just sit there, like a potato. You got to work at it. But I think it's just great.
Yeah, I'm sure I think he was an influence on Pedro Costa. Certainly, if in Vonda's room, and certainly he was influenced from literally many filmmakers, many art filmmakers, and doing some of those same things way early before. I think again ahead of his time in a way. Sometimes.
Well, other people were toying with some of the same ideas. I mean, Warhol's often in the mix. It's one of the important things that I try to stress in my book is that he wasn't an outsider. He was very much engaged in the particular aesthetic conversations, artistic conversations happening at any given time. So, he was never alone. He always makes sense art historically in his moment. And that's very important to me to recognize that there's, he's part of the conversation. He's not a freak.
No, I mean, your book is, again, you decided to write, for lack of a better word, a more traditional type of biography in its comprehensiveness and its accuracy and detail and very conscientious. And I really appreciate that, again, because there's not a lot, but there is some stuff out there that's not possessed of that integrity, and your book has that. And I'm wondering about your chronology as a thinker and a writer, how you got into art writing, and take me back to your earlier days or Pennsylvania or whatever to write a book of this achievement. What went into that? Talk about your story with that.
Well, Pennsylvania doesn't have a huge role in it because we moved from Philadelphia to Montreal when I was 5. My parents were both professors at McGill, moved to become professors at McGill University. And And they were very, very small-scale collectors, but of works by pop artists, Lichtenstein, Oldenburg. They, in fact, didn't like Warhol. So the Warhol we had, which I used to look at, as I've said many times, for many minutes every day, was in the bathroom. So I got to know that from a seated position, and it was just a poster of a Marilyn. But I remember really studying it very closely. My parents also were part-time art critics, so I was surrounded by art and talk about art from a very, very young age. And then they went on from pop to collect very early computer-generated art and some interesting material like that. But then I was, very briefly a commercial photographer because I wanted to get away from the family business of academia. Yeah. And I failed dismally to get away from it. Within a few years, I was back in university. And I was obsessed. I went to McGill and was obsessed with the Middle Ages. And in fact, my first degree was in medieval studies, kind of ad hoc degree in medieval studies. So I did tons of Anglo-Saxon and Latin.
Wow.
And then started a PhD in England about 10th century Italian land contracts in northern Italy, in Lombardy, and worked away at it, beavered away at it. And actually really quite loved the work, but the sources were so goddamn dry. They were all in Latin. And in fact, I was just working on land contracts. So not even narrative sources, really recalcitrant documents. And that just eventually killed me. And I switched into art history. That's where it really all started. Then I was an art historian, got my doctorate, and an art critic went on vacation in Toronto. And I filled in for him at the Globe and Mail newspaper in Toronto, and that was the beginning of my career.
Well, Globe and Mail is a great start. It's a wonderful paper, right? And
I was very lucky
to be writing for them. So what years would that have been at the Globe and Mail when you
I was only at the Globe and Mail for, 4 years. I actually started out as their fine arts editor in 96 and then left in 2000 to become the chief art critic at the Washington Post.
Wow.
So that's really where I guess you could say I cut my teeth at the Globe and Mail, but it was really at the Washington Post under the supreme editorship of John Pancake, who was the arts editor, who really helped me become however good I am today, I owe it to John Pancake.
I'm wondering when you're working at a paper like Globe and Mail and then later the Washington Post, in those years, what are you seeing that really struck you that has stayed today, that really you wrote about something or saw something that really captured your imagination in a way that had lasting power, and you say, well, boy, I'm writing about these same things today, or I'm writing, what I wrote back in 97, 96 is still relevant, or still, what comes to your mind when you?
That's a difficult question, because one of the glories of being a fine art critic is that you're seeing so much and writing about so much. So you do end up writing about the same things again and again. I've got a Picasso piece coming out in the New York Times in the next few days. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is I don't know, the 10th Picasso piece I've written. I'm sure I wrote one in Toronto, and then I certainly wrote more than one in Washington. So there is that kind of constant continuity just because of kind of the big names of art that keep coming back again and again. And then there's all the contemporary art that you see. As an all-purpose mass media art critic, you end up covering all kinds of art, which is one of the glories, and maybe we can talk about how it's also a big problem. But, the contemporary art photography video, right. I learned so much. I came into my work as an art critic loving contemporary art, knowing something about it, but, my PhD was in 16th century Italian art and art theory. So there was a big learning curve, and, it took me a long time, and it was really the artists out there, that I was looking at that taught me what I needed to know.
Would you say, typically people talk about the difference or even opposition between studying something that's classical or something that is in the 17th century, 16th century, Middle Ages, even further back. They often say someone that knows that field might be a little bit alienated from something we call contemporary or modern. But I'm wondering if the reverse is also true. I'm wondering what about your scholarship in those periods helped you or gave you certain insight into contemporary art possibly, or if that prepared you in some way. Yeah.
I absolutely refuse to make a distinction between contemporary art and older art forms. I mean, I think the act of understanding art and the act of interpreting art and the act of writing about art is the same regardless of the material.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for a very complicated philosophical reason that maybe we can get into later.
Okay.
But it's,
yeah.
I do, I do use a lot of the same skills. My PhD was actually mostly about the nature of representation. So how pictures can represent things like perspective, but not only perspective, what it means literally for a picture to represent the world, which is philosophically way more complicated than you'd ever imagine. I mean, hundreds of philosophers have addressed the question of what it means for a picture to represent, and there still isn't a really crisp answer for that question. So that, of course, gave me a lot of material for both, any picture that represents, but also in a sense for any picture that doesn't represent, because the issues are still there. By virtue of not representing the world, you're still invoking issues of representation in a sense. So that particular background of mine has been extremely useful in understanding the nature of picturing, if you like. And in my interest in philosophy also has I think stood me in good stead. Lately, especially, I've been reading a lot of philosophy, philosophical aesthetics in the sort of analytic tradition, and that's been extremely exciting for me.
What have you been reading? Have you been reading Dante or what comes to your mind when you say you like Panofsky or more current or Dave Hickey or what?
Well, I've been reading, there's a philosopher at Berkeley called Alva Noe, N-O-E, who I'm very excited by. He's done several books now on art, and is actually coming out with a new one. And I think he's got some very, very interesting ideas about the way art functions, fine art. I like to use the word fine art. I think he just uses the word art. The way fine art functions differently than other kinds of pictures and other kinds of visual culture in our society. And I've been developing some ideas sort of in tandem with his and taking some of his ideas further as well.
I like to see what you do with that, because on our show we often discuss these issues. I mean, I often have written things on representation or a broader definition of representation than is typically used, so that as you said, the non-representational still, in some sense representational. But I'm wondering, when you see the Marilyn sitting on the John.
Yes. Marilyn wasn't sitting on the John. I was sitting on the John. Let's just be very clear about that. Yeah. Yes.
You're sitting on the John and looking at Marilyn Monroe, and now you wrote this incredible book. Talk a little bit about how you become known, how you become a, connoisseur, and also in some sense, someone that knows a lot about Warhol. Was this over many decades, or was this over I would imagine some time, right?
Well, I mean, again, I'll come back to what it is to be a mass media art critic. You end up writing about Warhol with some regularity just because Warhol's out there. There are shows, there are exhibitions of Warhol. And one of the interesting things when I was at the Washington Post is there were several shows, I guess, of the late Warhol work, which has often been slighted by art critics and art historians, and still gets slighted.
Yeah, it does.
And seeing those shows really woke me up to the late Warhol, which was interesting and different from the material I knew before. But of course, I'd seen pop art shows. Mm-hmm. There was a great show at the National Gallery called Warhol Headlines about Warhol's interaction with the news. Right. So, I was exposed to all sorts of Warholism, and that was the baseline for writing the book. But of course, that doesn't get you anywhere near to where you need to be a biographer. And that just came from, I would say that actually came out of my first PhD in 10th century Italian.
There you go. That's right.
History, because I already was an archive rat because of that. Mm-hmm. And the great thing, if you read, a really great historian like Peter Brown, who's just about my all-time favorite historian, who wrote about, late Roman Christianity especially, is that what they do is they take really, really, awkward, recalcitrant documents and make them sing and make them talk about the subject at hand. So, you take a silly old saint's life and you realize, no, this tells us about how people were thinking about society and about religion in, say, the 5th century. And that really, learning to do that as a historian really helped me realized that the quite miscellaneous objects that survived in the archives in Pittsburgh, the Warhol archives, could really sing if you looked at them right and talked about them right and looked at enough of them. So I really learned about Warhol I guess you'd say the hard way, or maybe it was the easy way, the delightful way, by just digging into the Warhol archives in Pittsburgh under the guidance of, unfortunately, the now late Matt Werbican, who's one of the great archivists. And, having him at my shoulder, we were supposed to close the archive up at 6 o'clock. I was supposed to be chased out, but Matt and I would end up talking till 9, easily 9 or 10 at night, just about the objects and about Warhol. And, it was just an amazing immersion into Warhol. And with Warhol, because of those archives, you can be immersed into his life in a very magical, special way.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I'm thinking about all those album covers and New Yorker covers in the 50s and then the Factory and just I don't know, well, eclecticism is one word I guess someone could use, but just a career. And I'm thinking about The Last Supper and you studying the 10th century and the iconography, and it just comes to my mind for some reason that late Warhol and the texts about the AIDS crisis and his Catholicism and
let's you've got to be very, very careful talking about Warhol's Catholicism. I will never use the phrase because Catholicism for 99.9% of Americans means Roman Catholicism, right? It means the Catholicism of Italians and the Irish. And he was a member of a very, very, very different group. That's right. Which was actually in real tension, in conflict with the Irish and especially Irish Catholics in the 1920s or earlier in the United States. So it's really a mistake to think of him as a Catholic in any normal sense. You might as well, I prefer to call him a Ruthenian or a Byzantine Catholic because the word Byzantine Catholic comes with Catholic as part of the word. People get confused about that. And there's a lot of very sloppy talk about Warhol as a religious figure or as a Catholic.
If you want to, you could talk further about some of those differences if you think it's appropriate. But I do think that studying the 10th century and these kind of documents, there is some connection there in terms of, I guess, how an artist interprets their own experience or their own beliefs, or their in a more general sense. Certainly, it's always there.
Although I think I'm not terribly interested in the notion of self-expression, as a model for what art is. I don't think it's coherent, as it were, philosophically. And I don't think, why the hell do we particularly want to see someone else's self-expression? I'm not that interested in other people's self. I want them to talk about the world. Yeah. And Warhol does that, I think. Right. Warhol, again, the notion of Warhol, because he's such a character, because he's so interesting as a human being, there's a tendency, and I guess I've completely contributed to it, to conflate the life and the art and the reasons for doing that. Mm-hmm. But, he's a really serious, sophisticated artist, as much as any other artist you could name. Right. He knew his art history. He knew contemporary art backwards and forwards. Yeah. So he's in conversation with the other art being made at every moment in his life. And that's what I think he cared about. Sure. The sort of one take-home message that I got from studying his life is that he cared deeply, deeply, deeply about art. And more than anything else, he wanted to be the most exciting artist, at any given moment in his life and career.
Well, he in some sense succeeded at that goal. That was
I believe so. He made, let's be direct. Like every artist ever, he made some bad work, and especially in the 80s and 70s, he made a lot of bad work. Mm-hmm. But at every moment that he's making bad work, he's also making superb work. There's hardly, a 2 or 3 year period that goes by where there isn't something really important being turned out. And of course, in the 60s, there's something important and interesting being turned out every month. But the range is astounding, as you said.
Yeah, and it's astounding his knowledge of art history and his knowingness about all that, but also those many years in the commercial world, which, again, a lot of known modern artists worked in the commercial field, but they didn't do it as well as they weren't as good at that as Warhol was at that, right? So Warhol's record album covers are some of the best record album covers, and his New Yorker covers are
or superb and have, they just.
Well, not New Yorker. He didn't do New Yorker covers, but he did covers for all sorts of other fabulous publications like the New Yorker. Although it's important to recognize that his commercial work, I think, is in a completely different register than his later fine art, or for that matter, than his fine art in the 1950s.
Right.
So I think he was a superb commercial artist and a superb,
fine art.
I shouldn't say superb, a very good commercial artist and a superb fine artist, but not the two things at the same time, if you like. They're separate. I think they're very separate hats.
It's highly unusual, I think, that somebody is so good at both. I mean, it seems to me. I mean, that seems unique.
Well, although it's important to recognize that he wasn't at the time in the 50s considered a genius of commercial art. His work was very much like other artists who'd already done things. So, for instance, he's deeply indebted to Ben Shahn. Mm-hmm. And so he's really part of a school of artists doing similar work. I once played a mean trick on Matt Werbican, the great Warhol archivist, by showing him 3 Warhols and asking him what he thought of them. And he told me about them, and he said, this about this one and that about that one. And then I said, actually, Matt, none of those are by Andy Warhol. They're all by other illustrators working at exactly the same moment. So, in fact, there was a school of illustration working in the kind of, I wonder how one should describe it, a kind of artisanal mode, an outsider mode. The important thing about Warhol's commercial illustration is that he was willing to embrace kind of fey style, an effeminate style. That was sort of an element in this movement, but he went much further with it. So he was willing to, in a sense, very subtly out himself as a gay man in his work. And I think that helped the work sell, because it was selling to sophisticated women, right. And there was something about the effeminate in the work that matched the product he was selling.
Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. What do you think that so-called effeminate dimension, or some of those qualities, is one of the, for lack of a better term, innovative things in Warhol, or one of the things that made him stand out in that sense, you would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think Warhol's homosexuality, his play with homosexuality, with camp especially, it's really completely vital to understanding, what he did. Almost all his art has, there's some kind of a queer reading of it. It's not the only reading of most of the art, though some of the art, maybe it's almost the only reading. I mean, think about his movie called Blowjob.
Oh yeah.
Everyone reads that as, classic queer Warhol. But of course, you never get to see who's doing the felating. So it could just as well be a woman, as it were, blowing a man. But we all assume that it's gay. So there's almost always more than one reading.
I'm a little weird because I talked about that movie on my video stream, and I compared it to Carl Dreyer. So I think
interesting.
Well, I do. I think there's that artistic dimension to Warhol. The things that kind of that you see in Dreyer and Bresson.
Very interesting. I said very interesting. I should out myself right now as a filmic, almost ignoramus. It's just not, I've just been a busy person, and there are always film critics doing film reviews. So I don't know as much about film as I'd like to. I know a little bit about the film that was right around Warhol, Jonas Mekas and those people. But I have to admit that though I love, especially art film over the decades, my wife, who's an artist, knows infinitely more about it than I do.
Interesting. Well, I'm kind of wondering if you don't mind talking about some of your philosophies regarding issues of representation and expression, or non-expression, or not the intentional fallacy, or anything else, because you said you had a lot of ideas about that. And this podcast is the perfect place to get into the weeds on those things. And I'm wondering if we want to start from where you started thinking philosophically about these things and how they've developed over time, not just Warhol, but the way you approach works of art in general when you write about them, and how it's informed by your understandings of it.
Yeah, sure. We can try to do that. The weeds we get into may be so high that we'll get completely lost. But let me try if I possibly can. I think the issue comes. I came of age as an art historian in the 1990s when there was a lot of emphasis on replacing the notion of art or fine art with the notion of visual culture. That is saying, there's a hierarchy involved in deciding that some objects are the stuff called fine art and some objects are somehow lesser, decorative arts, etc. So let's get rid of all of those distinctions and look at, a hubcap with exactly the same eyes that we use for the Mona Lisa. And let's just call it all visual culture. And a lot of visual culture is about using objects for magical purposes. I mean, there's all sorts of uses of objects that art history has been ignoring. And that's been very important development in art history. But I think that it left out the fact that there still is a category of fine art. And we'll get back to it in 1 second. There's because the category is a hard, problematic word. There is something called fine art, and there's a way of looking at objects at certain parts of visual culture that's different than the way we look at other parts of visual culture. And it often has to do with the kind of objects we're looking at. So if you're looking at a Robert Rauschenberg, pretty obvious that demands a fine art approach. Now, you can also look at it financially. There's all sorts of aspects of it that have nothing to do with it being fine art. But one of the things you're likely to do is use the tools of criticism of discourse that have been developed over the last 500 years. But I think, and this is where to a certain extent I'm following Alva Noé's notions, that there's a particular way that involves a particular way of thinking and talking as much as it involves a particular kind of object. So Alva Noé distinguishes between pictures, which we use, every single day. If we want to buy something from the supermarket, maybe we look at a brochure. If we want to, buy pens on Amazon, we look at the pictures there. We use pictures for all sorts of things.
Yes.
But some pictures we use to think about pictures, to think about what pictures are, what the world is like. I like to use the phrase machines for thinking. That's my phrase, not Alva Noé's. So he distinguishes between normal tools, art being used as a tool for doing things like buying pens on Amazon, or for that matter, celebrating a king or praying to God, right? Those are normal pictures being used as tools. And what he calls strange tools. His book about this subject is actually called Strange Tools. And the strange tools are what I would call fine art. That is, they're much more philosophical. They're used philosophically. And I think that Alva would agree with me about this. It's not actually so much about there being two sets of objects. So it's not that there are objects that deserve one kind of attention and objects that deserve a different kind of attention. It's that there are different functions that objects can serve. And one function that any object can serve is that it can function as fine art. It can get you thinking. So you take the same object, take a Campbell soup can in the kitchen, and it has a very clear set of functions as a tool, and put it in a museum, in Warhol's case, by painting it onto a canvas, and it becomes a strange tool. It becomes a work of art.
That's right.
And I argue that that those strange tools, I think, have only existed since about 1500 in the West. That's when the Renaissance essentially invents the category of fine art.
That's right.
And it's a different category from other categories of visual objects. And so that's very important for me to understand the power and particularity and, frankly, oddness of fine art. It's a weird, peculiar phenomenon. Not all cultures are going to indulge in it. Not all human beings in the West are going to be interested in it, and they shouldn't be. It's as esoteric as cricket, or name something esoteric, stamp collecting. I mean, I think it has fabulous possibilities for someone who gets involved with it, but it is peculiar and specialized set of tasks that are involved in using your fine art brain, as it were, to look at things. So that's very important for me, obviously, in looking at Warhol, because the mistake about Warhol is thinking that he's really part of popular culture. That is, that his pictures are in some sense tools. And I'm going to say, no, they're strange tools. He's a fine artist thinking in fine art terms. And we have to think about all the objects he makes, including goofy ones from the 1980s, like his appearance on the Love Boat. We have to think about them in terms of fine art. There you go. There's the weeds for you.
Well, that's those weeds aren't too tall. That's fine. But I don't disagree with that approach. I'm interested though about 1500 to 2022, and if you think what the developments that you think have been happening over such a great span of time, and artists like Warhol doing something. Would you say that your concept is connected to defamiliarization, which is an older kind of art term, or is it?
I mean, that's central to fine art. Yeah. And actually, there's a much closer connection between Warhol and the world of 1500 than even than anything else than that. Because I think that Warhol's, the crucial notion for understanding Warhol is appropriation. It's taking something from one sphere of human culture and transferring it into the sphere of fine art. So the Brillo box, of course, is the most famous example, but the Campbell soups work that way too. Yep. And there are lots of other examples in Warhol. And my argument is that that's actually how fine art gets invented in 1500. That people take works of art that originally would have been meant for sacred purposes, altarpieces essentially, and decide that there's another way those can be used, that they can be treated as fine art. And we even have texts from that period where people say, there's a real problem in using altarpieces as fine art, that there's a problem in thinking about altarpieces in terms of how beautiful they are. That's not what they're for. They're meant to talk to God. They're not meant to talk to us aesthetically. And there's a moment in the early 16th century where people say, you know what, we should actually take these objects out of churches where they're meant for sacred use and put them in secular settings, basically in museums, and take them out of their functional context and use them as this non-functional thing we call art. So that appropriation, taking something from one context and putting it into the new context of fine art, is at the root of the very concept of fine art. And that's one reason I'm so interested in Warhol, because he's the greatest appropriation artist of all time. So that notion of appropriation, I think, is vital to the history of fine art in the West, and it revives fine art a bunch of times when fine art started getting boring. Manet uses photography just to supercharge his art. That's
right. Well, I think, yeah, certainly that's important. I'm just wondering, of more recent developments. You said you started working a lot in the 90s, and I'm wondering how you see that period from the 90s to now. If there's anything that's noteworthy that you think you should mention about what's happened in fine art, or how fine art communicates with the world outside of fine art.
I mean, I think the maturing of video art. Now, of course, Andy Warhol did the very, very first work of video art ever, Outer and Inner Space. It's amazing. One of the great works of all time by anyone is the film and video piece he did of Edie Sedgwick. Really a fabulous thing. But the maturing of video art for me is the most important thing that's happened in my career. People like Douglas Gordon, Stan Douglas, and embrace, among other things, of real narrativity, of narrative storytelling in something that still has the sophistication of fine art. That for me is the most important thing that has happened. And the current Whitney Biennial in New York has a lot of video and a lot of fairly narrative video. And I think that's extremely important. It's certainly the most exciting thing that's happened since I came into the world of fine art and of contemporary art. And it's still ongoing. I mean, it's funny, there's still a resistance to video art that for me proves that there's something interesting going on there.
What is that resistance? Is it just people other than ordinary Philistinism, or is it something else? Or are they, again, what do people not?
Well, video art requires time. I mean, it may be as simple as that, right? Yeah. Take some time to look at video. I mean, I love that aspect of it. I just love being able to sit down and look. But for a lot of people, I mean, if you look, and this has been done a million times, you get a stopwatch out and you look at how long people look at paintings, even, the most famous paintings in the world. It's very, very, very limited time. And video really doesn't quite allow you to do that. But at the same time as it doesn't allow you to do that, it invites you to just sit back and enjoy, the way TV does. Video art for me is like watching good TV, and I'm happy just to be a little bit passive and look at the stuff. That's right. So for me, it's more relaxing than having to figure out what a painting is about. That's really hard work. And you're on your feet, that's exhausting. Spending an hour looking at a painting is far more exhausting than spending an hour looking at a video. That's right. The video carries you along if it's any good. It's got some hint of narrative to it usually. It's got something to say. It's I can't speak highly enough of good video art. Now, there's bad video art, but there's bad everything art too.
Sure. What is at the Whitney Biennial that was just there that you want to speak about? Particular works or people that really excited you? You were really want to mention?
Good question. I'm always bad at names when they I have to suddenly come up with them. Hang on one second. Well, the Philadelphia artist Alex DaCosta, if I'm getting the name exactly right, is extremely interesting. I've written about him a few times, so I should be able to get his name absolutely right. He did a very strange piece where he essentially dresses up as Duchamp, has Duchamp, among other things, has Duchamp fondling works by Brancusi in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's very funny. It's a video projection. Very, very funny work. I'm trying to think of what else really grabbed my fancy. There were a bunch of videos as well, but of course, when I'm on the spot, I can't think of one this minute. If we keep talking about other things, I'm sure one will come to mind. And you just suddenly went dead.
Technical difficulties, of course.
No problem.
So what were your impressions of The Clock? You remember this film by Christopher, phasing on his last name.
Yeah, I can't believe that I am too. I know him. It's not Christopher, it's Christian. Oh my God, I can't believe I don't remember his name all of a sudden. It'll come to me in a minute. I love that piece. I think it's one of the most charming pieces. I should describe it a little bit for your listeners. Yeah. Christian Markley, of course. It's all he did was, and it's a little hard to describe, is he took thousands and thousands of snippets from movies that show someone looking at a clock, or that show a clock, or show a wristwatch, and essentially clip them out like little tiny samples, a few seconds, maybe 10, 15 seconds at most, clip them all out, and then put them in the chronological order of a passing day. So the glimpse of a clock that's at midnight comes first, and then the glimpse of a clock that's at midnight and 1 second or 1 minute comes next. And it's basically a 24-hour clock of clocks in film. And it's absolutely hilarious because it does things like, for instance, if you show up, and he shows it, of course, over the course of 24 hours, ideally, and you can show up at 1 a.m. and see all the clocks that are showing 1 a.m., which means that there's a lot of images of people sleeping. Then at various times, people, of course, are having breakfast at 8 a.m. So there's all the clocks that show 8 a.m. People are often having breakfast or just waking up from a love affair or something like that. It's utterly, utterly charming. I mean, one of the most, as much fun as you could ever have looking at art. Yeah,
I'm glad that you feel that way about it, because I was blown away by that, and I recommend The Clock.
Me too. I mean, I guess there's a slight issue over the years. I still enjoy, every time I see it, I just love it. The question is it a tiny bit facile? Does it really deliver the full complexity of, really, really difficult, important, challenging art, profound art? I think it does probably, but the pill certainly goes down very, very easily thanks to Christian Markley. And maybe it's easy for people just to wallow in the pleasure of it. Now, there ain't nothing wrong with wallowing in pleasure when it comes to art. So, I'm willing to live with that. You can wallow in Tintoretto too.
Mm-hmm. What about Cremaster, Matthew Barney? What are your?
I'm not a fan of Matthew Barney, and I can say that live because I've written just that. Yeah. I think it's too much like surrealism for me to be interested in it. I'm not interested in occult, esoteric, surrealism, which is really what it is. It's really just surrealism brought into film. I mean, they're beautifully made films, but of course, he's got a wonderful team of people who are talented. So I think that that's not surprisingly beautiful. I'm just not interested in them. But other people are, and that's I certainly respect that.
When you're on dais or panels, and if you had the curse or the blessing or opportunity to be presented with people, community individuals who don't really fully know much about Warhol, and you were given the task to introduce them to this monumental figure Warhol, where do you typically begin, or where do you if
it's kind of obvious. You begin with the Campbell soups. It's such a cliche, but they are really, in that one moment, they reveal much of what Warhol got up to later. Not in the films, of course, or only in a roundabout way in the films. Mm-hmm. But, whenever I'm talking to people who don't know much about art, I think the very best thing to do is to take one work of art and start unpacking it and talking about it. And hopefully I can, because I get incredibly excited when I'm unpacking a work of art, trying to make it sing. And the really important thing is for people to realize that that's the pleasure in it, that it's really exciting to figure out what a work of art is. That works of art are all unbelievably difficult and unbelievably stupid in a way. They're just these objects that sit there. Yeah. And it's your job to figure out why the hell you should be looking at them. And when you do that, it gets really exciting. So that's what I do whenever I'm with someone who doesn't already have those fine art tools. It's just demonstrate what it is to unpack a work, I guess in my ideal unpacking, I do the Campbell soups and maybe the screen tests, or maybe even Empire, the 8-hour footage of the Empire State Building. But that would certainly be my way of going about it.
That's a good, and of course in your biography, did you want to talk a little bit about Valery Solanas' shooting and the effect it had on his work or scope? It happened. It's a big topic, of course, but I do sense something there in terms of an event in his life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in fact, we can end the podcast on that. It's a great way to end, because that's how I begin my book, which is with this horrible, bloody moment where he's just been shot by Valery Solanas only once. Even just quite recently in a major newspaper, I saw them referring to him being shot more than once. He was shot once in the side on June 3rd, 1968. Really was so close to death, he might as well have been dead. And this amazing surgeon called Giuseppe Rossi, who I got to interview long before his death about the surgery and the shooting. It was pure luck that Rossi was there on that day, this incredibly talented surgeon who knew both all about advanced thoracic surgery and about gunshot wounds. He just happened to be in the hospital on that day, and he was the person who saved Warhol's life. But the Valery Solanas thing, I actually go out of my way in my book to destroy what I think is a fallacy, and I've been completely unsuccessful because it's a classic myth, that everything changed when he was shot. That, you have the wild life of the silver factory, and then boom, he's shot and he gets scared, and he decides to change his life and his clothing, etc. No, I don't. But if you look at the chronology, he was already doing that before he was shot.
That's right.
January of 68, 6 months, exactly 6 months before he was shot, he's already cleaning up the factory. He's moved out of the famous scruffy silver factory into a very nice, tidy space that could pass as an architect's office.
That's right.
Acolytes are starting to, the druggies are starting to move out, and he's got new people like Fred Hughes moving in. He really is very well on his way to being a the 1970s Warhol before he's shot. So I think it's a mistake to think that the change is that great. He realized he'd exhausted the possibilities of that particular persona and of pop art as well. Mm-hmm. And he's moving, again, before he's shot, he's moving on to some quite cryptic, difficult conceptual art, which is where the whole art world was moving. So I think it's a mistake to imagine. I mean, obviously, you get shot and almost die, it's going to change anyone's life. Sure. But I don't think it really had that profound an effect on him as a creative figure in the culture. I think he was on his way already.
I actually really like 70s Warhol, more than many do. I think it's an interesting period.
Well, that maybe we can end on the note that it's one of the frustrations for anyone who studies Warhol is that the academic world of Warhol scholars are extremely interested in 70s and 80s Warhol, the piss paintings, the camouflage paintings, the Rorschach paintings. But for whatever reason, the popular admiration for Warhol is still based in the pop works, and that's true even among popular non-specialist art critics. So it's been a frustration of mine that even with my biography, which is absolutely geared towards a popular audience, I haven't been able to move the discussion as far forward as I like. But I think that may be changing with this new, the Netflix documentary on the diaries. That's all set in the 70s and 80s. I think that it's not really about the art, but I think there is a growing interest in later Warhol, even among the general public. And I hope that that continues, and that maybe we can change what it is that matters. If we can make Warhol the filmmaker and Warhol the artist of the 70s and 80s matter to the general public as much as Marilyn and the soup cans do, then we'll have done God's work, I think.
Yes. Well, I really thank you for your generosity and time and coming on our podcast, because you speak very eloquently, but also relatable way. The audience can be inspired and go out and get this Warhol book. It's worth reading every page, I must say. And so thank you.
Well, thank you for reading every page, Mitch. It's a long read, I know.
It is.
I really appreciate anyone who goes through the whole thing. I should make a special club of people who've read all of my book. Like there should be a club of people who've watched all of Empire and who've read all of Blake Gopnik's biography of Andy Warhol.
That's right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.